This session, as you know, will focus on enlargement, one of the most important topics, I would say, at this point in European politics. And to talk about this and have this conversation, we are joined by Janis Emmanouilidis. He is Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies at the European Policy Center. We're also joined by Christides. He is co-chair and also part of the organizing committee of the Balkans and Black Sea Forum. Also joining us is Winand Quaedvlieg. He is Vice President of the Employers Group European Economic and Social Committee. And last but not least, Lykourgos Liakakos. He is Scientific Director for the Mediterranean Island Center for Culture and Development, MESONISOS. Janis, perhaps a first question to start this debate. The world is in such disarray. I think that was made very clear in this forum. Some would argue the idea of enlargement, more members coming into the European Union, this makes it more necessary than ever. It's better to have these countries incorporated now in this project than to have them in a form of limbo in this chaotic world. Others argue the moment is so difficult that it's simply not real or realistic to say that you can do that effort. On top of everything that's going on, the EU has to reform and be stronger first. Your take?
I think that we need to do both. Mm-hmm. I think that actually there is an enlargement imperative, given the situation in which we are, especially since 22, since the invasion of Ukraine. And now after the second watershed moment of the past 3 years, November 5, I think it's even more important that we take us seriously when we say that the EU needs to enlarge, that there is a geopolitical imperative for the EU to enlarge. At the same time, we also need to reform ourselves in order to prepare the enlarging union for what is coming, what is already happening. So there's already, by the way, a reform imperative at this moment in time, independent of enlargement. So I think we need to do both things together. We need to think them together, which means we also need to conceptualize of how we want to progress, what our strategic options are when it comes to EU enlargement and when it comes to EU reform. But now you ask me, will it happen? Are we preparing ourselves? Are we ready to do so? And in full brutal honesty, I must say that we're not. We are saying in Sunday talks and in declarations that we need to enlarge the European Union, but actually I don't see that we're progressing according to the needs of the day. There is more discussion with respect to Ukraine. There are some people who are saying even that we might have to speed track the accession of Ukraine to the European Union. But I would even argue here, Ukraine is not enough. We've given the Western Balkan countries a promise for decades that they would be ready and able to join, but we're not delivering on that. When it comes to EU reform, in policy terms, I think we now have identified two main priorities, and that was also discussed during the forum. One is economic competitiveness of Europe, including economic security, and the second being defense. But also, if you look into those two areas, we do not have the right mindset in order to actually do these policy reforms. We're not going far enough. If you listen carefully to Mario Draghi, not only reading his report, but also seeing, I put it in my words, his frustration when it comes to the EU's ability to actually implement what he has been asking for, you can see that we're lagging behind. If you look into European defense, we have the white paper on European defense. It goes in the right direction. It's moving the needle. It's going far beyond where we had been months or years ago, but we need to do much more. And we need to have also the stamina to do it for a long time, because we're living in what we at the EPC have been calling a permacrisis, and I don't think that the situation will be improving. And if you want to actually have progress in policy terms, you also need to reform and adapt the EU's operating system. So that's the internal reform bit to the new realities. For those who yesterday were witnessing Guy Verhofstadt, he was telling us that we actually need to reform the EU treaties. We need a constitution for Europe. That is not on the cards. The European Parliament has been asking for this for a long time, but the appetite in the member states is not along those ways. So we need to also think about how we can progress when it comes to EU reform gradually, but start that process. So when you hear representatives of the EU saying, we had President Costa, the President of the European Council, 2 weeks ago at the EPC, and he was being asked, when are we going to reform the EU treaties? And what he said was, we're going to reform the EU treaties when we enlarge. I think this is not the right mindset. We actually need to prepare ourselves for an enlarging EU. We do not know whether to enlarge, who it will enlarge to, how big it will become, when that will happen. But I think we need to start the progress of preparing ourselves for an enlarging EU. But we're not doing that, because the argument is that the Lisbon Treaty, which is the basic treaty of the EU, is enlargement proof. I think that the Lisbon Treaty and the operating system of the EU is proving that it is neither enlargement nor future, nor crisis proof. So there's a lot of homework that needs to be done, but the question is whether the EU 27 will be able to deliver. And now some people will tell me, well, look at how difficult the situation is, for example, when it comes to the current Hungarian government. We've had now numerous situations of 26 versus 1, I would say, where the 26 were able to progress. But if you look into issues related to enlargement and reform, you will see that there are huge differences among the 26. It's too easy to argue 26 versus 1. We have also complex and difficult positions among member states on strategic questions among the 26. So there is, I think, a big question, I'll end with that, of how we define the we. We often talk about we, Europeans, we, you, but is actually the EU 27 the we of the future? We're already seeing that there are increasing coalitions of the willing when it comes to defense, which do not only include the EU 27, but also non-EU countries, if you look into the UK, Norway, and others. And the question is, who are the member states who are really willing to progress in future? And will those member states, the willing and able, will they do so within the EU treaty framework, which allows member states to progress? There are instruments of differentiations allowing member states to progress, or will there be a need for member states even to cooperate outside the EU treaty? If you look into the area of defense, and I'm looking into the audience, there are people who are very informed about EU defense, we see that we're already seeing that there is a momentum for example, putting together an intergovernmental fund in some way to finance procurement on defense, which happens outside the EU treaties. The question is, how do you organize that? How do you, even if you have willing and who want to progress, you have to do it outside. How do you do it in a way that you do not undermine the EU and its institutional structures? So there are a lot of difficult cookies we need to swallow, we need to deal with, and I feel that unfortunately we're not living up to the needs of what we actually need to do, both with respect to enlargement and reform in a world which I must say will not become easier, but become more difficult, and Europe is being probably squeezed more than others in this world.
And just very briefly to follow up and wrap this from every perspective, there's a question which we haven't mentioned, but just as the introduction of the timeline and the deadline. The idea was 2030 was hard but realistic. You mentioned the head of the European Council, Antonio Costa. He no longer puts a number on it. He doesn't talk about 2030 anymore. Do we believe that is credible? It's better to say no deadlines. It creates too much pressure, stress.
You know what? I have gotten my lesson since 2008 with the various chapters of what I call the Permacrisis. To not dare to try to look into the crystal ball, because who knows what the situation will look in 6 months' time, in a year's time, or in 2 years' time. We might find ourselves as Europeans in a situation where the accession of Ukraine will become much more imminent than it seems today. Yeah. If that is the case, we need to prepare for that. And we need to prepare for that both with respect to how we would enlarge, and I believe that we should not only enlarge to Ukraine if we take the decision to actually enlarge the European Union. We should not have a limited enlargement. But if you think along these lines, again, we do not know when, who, and when that would happen in terms of enlargement. You need to prepare also to reform the EU. That's not something where you can say we can postpone things, and it will happen once we get to the point where we have to do it. This is the logic of we will do things when the crisis becomes worse and worse. But I think that's the mistake we've committed in the past. Look at what we did in the context of the euro crisis. We knew that economic and monetary union was not complete, and then we were faced with that crisis. When it came to migration, we knew that the pressures of migration would increase. Did we prepare ourselves for what happened in 2015? People were telling us a long time that we will have to face global pandemics. Did we prepare to what happened with respect to the COVID crisis? So I think the EU needs to be much more proactive and prepare ourselves for a situation which actually we know will potentially become worse and happen, rather than being always reactive. And the reactive mode, I think, given the gravity of the moment of what we're now facing, which has to do with war and peace, does not allow us to be reactive. We need to be proactive. And that goes also for enlargement and reform.
Well, thank you for that. Winand, if I could just ask you, because we were talking before the panel started, about how this time enlargement could be different to certainly the past, but also the latest wave that we saw in Eastern Europe, which obviously by now, the idea is that it was a successful enlargement. My question perhaps for Winand, if we could go first to you, is how do you envision the architecture this time around?
Well, first of all, allow me to thank the Delphi Economic Forum for inviting me to participate in this session. I believe that all colleagues here on the podium, we are very lucky in a sense because there is no tomorrow of the forum. So what we say or analyze today will not be contradicted by the watershed news arriving every day from Washington. So I'm not a specialist in what concerns EU affairs. I will, let me say, express the views of an average citizen from the region. And as you mentioned, enlargement is looming very, very important for a number of states in the region. I'm talking about the Western Balkans, yes, of course, but not only. So even before these 3 latest months and the disruption that has been created and the unpredictability that it has imposed on the global geopolitical scene, enlargement was something that I believe was not one of the first priorities, either among the European citizens, let alone among the Eurocrats in Brussels. Reform also. Reform is needed. We heard this. I had the chance to follow the forum and many of its sessions for the last 3 days. You can't imagine the views that have been expressed about how Europe should proceed today after what has happened. And I heard very varying, differing views, some even contradicting views. There was one a common denominator, which is that this is one of the last chances Europe has to reform and live up to the challenges it's facing today. There were people who expressed, let me say, their optimism that this might happen or will happen because the challenges are great and they open a whole new global role for Europe to play. I don't know if we are ready, if the leadership in Europe is ready to assume this very important role. I say that because, allow me to underline that, to my judgment, we have, for the last decade or so, very, very poor European leadership. For instance,
What do you mean by that? The leaders are not up to the challenge that...
Up to the challenge, exactly. I mean, yesterday there was a very prominent, let me say, speaker who even expressed the view that President Trump is a blessing for Europe in the sense that he is awakening Europe. But nobody touched upon the price of this awakening. And the price is tragic. It is the loss of thousands of people, the destruction of a country, and this, let me say, war atmosphere that prevails not somewhere far away from us, in Europe. I believe that what happened in the issue of Ukraine is a huge ethical, political, geostrategic defeat of Europe, in the sense that until 2008 we were, how can I say, knowing and asking the US and NATO to consider seriously all the, let me say, these ideas about expansion and so on. So today we are left hanging as Europe, I mean, because suddenly all the ideals and the values we were fighting for, and we still want to fight for, have been let me say, transformed into interest for precious materials. These are all issues that Europe has to cope with. They are ethical issues. They are not only issues of, how can I say, geostrategic or defense and so on. So I belong to the people who are, let me say, cautiously optimistic that this brusque awakening and the way that this defeat occurred for Europe will hopefully produce a leadership which will take the responsibility in order to proceed with the right decisions concerning, first of all, reform, but also enlargement, because Europe can play a very important connecting role globally. It can also be not only, let me say, exert its soft power, soft and economic power, but also its geostrategic power. It will take time. It will take money. We have to decide to invest more money in all these new challenges which Europe is facing today. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. Obviously, there can be a big debate as to whether big strategic mistakes were made from the part of the Europeans. Some would say they were incredibly naive and so on. But obviously, the flip side to some of those arguments, the current leadership would say is, ultimately, a lot of this also comes down to Russia. You can't just take away 20% of a country just like that. In that sense, obviously, you know, they're having to be reactive to something that, well, they're not fighting the war. I mean, they're not the ones that are invading anyone. But I think that perhaps we could debate further on that when we talk about Ukraine specifically, where the focus of enlargement seems to be now. Now moving on, of course, Mr. Quaedvlieg, perhaps to go now into the technicalities. The enlargement process is always incredibly technical, and it's also political, because there needs to be a unanimous vote and a political will. How is this wave going to compare to the previous ones, or is this an entirely different scenario?
Well, I think indeed that we are talking about a very, very different scenario now. And I also think that talking about political leadership, if there is one subject where political leadership is needed, and in the candidate countries and in the EU, it is enlargement. If you compare the situation that we have now, the 10 candidate countries now, with the candidate countries in the 90s, and we had, of course, at the time, 10 countries plus East Germany. It's a bit forgotten, but it was a major exercise. And the 10 countries at the time had more or less a comparable experience just behind them, because they were all under communism, of course, except Cyprus and Malta. And because they had this experience, there was a very, very strong political will to get away from the past and to go into the future, to go towards Europe, to go towards prosperity, towards democracy, towards rule of law, towards freedom, towards market economy. So there was a very strong canalized political will, which made also possible that the sacrifices that the process demanded, that the populations were ready to accept them and to deal with them. I think that it was on the one hand, it was going towards the future. On the other hand, it was also they wanted an insurance that the Soviet Union would not come back, that Russia would not come back. And that was also a very, very important thing. Then when you look at Western Europe, this was the view for the candidate countries. If you look at Western Europe, I think at first there was quite some hesitation. There was a lot of hesitation and a lot of pessimism also in Western Europe. I remember it was at the time at the World Bank, and there were predictions for where the countries would go, and they were very, very dark, that within 3 years there would be a kind of dictatorships, and there would be xenophobism, etc., etc., etc. When I look at business, I was very much involved at the time in my organization, the Confederation of Industries, in developing a policy towards enlargement and toward new countries. The very first reaction of business was clearly negative. People were afraid of imports, of cheap imports, of false competition. And there were, in the first month, there were giant quantities of Russian aluminum coming to Rotterdam harbor. The whole harbor was filled with aluminum bars from Russia. But it very quickly changed as businesses realized what was the perspective for trade and for investment. And then a positive process started. And I think it's also extremely important, it's a bit forgotten now, but there were myriads of initiatives from civil society, from citizens, from mayors, from universities, from municipalities, from employers' organizations, from trade unions, from hospitals, etc., 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 to do something to help the region in the transition towards the new situation. And I think that is particularly something that in Russia it's completely forgotten. In Russia they only talk now about the efforts of the West to destroy Russia, but there was an enormous effort to build up Russia and to build up Eastern Europe. And then coming to the EU itself. And of course we should not forget, at the time there were no internal spoilers in the EU. There was no Orban, there were no others, no right-wing populist parties.
Can I just interrupt for a second, because that's a very important point. Everything that we talked about will only happen, whether you believe enlargement will happen, if a country like Hungary at this point also plays ball. To me, it's very interesting how Viktor Orban says enlargement in the Western Balkans is a good thing, but in Ukraine now, it would be a bad thing. How are you going to get to a formal consensus over this? Because we can talk about enlargement all we want. As it stands, it's very difficult to see how you can get to unanimity at 27.
Yeah.
Can you get around this?
Well, it's clear, of course, that the countries are very, very different from each other. The Western Balkans is a category on its own. Turkey is a category on its own. I would say that Ukraine and Moldova together are a category of its own. And then you have Georgia, which is still a different situation. I think there is, when you talk about Ukraine, there is, of course, the war. There is, of course, the transition from basically still in very much sense a Soviet economy to a modern, future-oriented economy. But on the other hand, Ukraine is a very big country. Mm-hmm. It is a very big market. It is, in a way, an ideal market because it's big, it's underdeveloped, and it has high-quality, skilled personnel. They have enormous resources, agriculture, and also raw materials. And they are now developing very fast as a consequence of the pressure of the war. They are developing a high-tech defense industry. The think tank Bruegel called it the affordable arsenal of Europe. So I think with all the difficulties that are there, the country also has an enormous perspective. And then you come back to what you said about the leadership. We can all talk about the problems, about the challenges, about the things that do not work. But we can also see the future. And if you compare what was achieved in Eastern Europe in the 90s, it was half a continent that was on the brink of collapse. It was economically, it was socially, it was politically, and it was morally on the ground. And the perspective of EU membership created the political will and created the energy, also in society, to move forward, and it led to a remarkable economic convergence. And that convergence at this moment is lacking in Ukraine, it's lacking in the Balkans, and we must create the process to bring it back, and it is possible.
Well, thank you for that. We'll do a final round on this, but before, of course, given that we're in Delphi and we're very happy to be in Greece, I know, Lykourgos, you wanted to perhaps take this conversation from a different perspective. So now we're going to switch to Greek for a second, and then we'll go back.
Thank you.
So yes, so everything we've talked about, of course.
Okay, thank you. Κύριε Πρόεδρε, αγαπητοί συνομιλητές, κυρία Ταντέο, αγαπητό κοινό, επιτρέψτε μου να κάνω μια μικρή εισαγωγή για το τι είναι το Permacrisis. Αυτή την εποχή διανύουμε αλλεπάλληλες, παράλληλες, συνεχόμενες διαδοχικές κρίσεις. οι οποίες αρχής γενομένης από το 2008 με τη χρηματοπιστωτική κρίση. Είχαμε το 2015 τη μεταναστευτική κρίση. Είχαμε το 2016 με το Brexit την κρίση συνοχής. Το 2020 την υγειονομική κρίση και μετά με τον πόλεμο είχαμε την πληθωριστική και ενεργειακή κρίση. Σε κάθε περίπτωση η Ευρώπη πρέπει πριν διευρυνθεί να μεταρρυθμιστεί δυνατά, ώστε να μπορέσει να προσδώσει εμπιστοσύνη και στους πολίτες της. Λοιπόν, μέχρι τώρα σας ανέφερα έναν πολύ κλισέ, ξύλινο λόγο που χιλιάδες φορές θα ακούσετε σε χιλιάδες ημερίδες και συνέδρια. Θα πω ένα, φτάνει. Πρέπει να αντιμετωπίσουμε πλέον την αλήθεια κατάματα. Η Ευρώπη μας που γέννησε τη δημοκρατία, η Ευρώπη των ευρωπαϊκών αξιών, του δυτικού κόσμου, κινδυνεύει να καταρρεύσει συνθέμελα, να μείνει μια διαχειρίστρια αέναων κρίσεων αντί να μπορέσει να τις προλαμβάνει. Και το ερώτημά μου είναι, τι Ευρώπη θέλουμε? Την Ευρώπη η οποία δρά ως μεγάλος λογιστής των μεγάλων κρατών μελών? Την Ευρώπη η οποία έχει αιμονές, κυρίως το ανεπαρκέστατο διευθυντήριό της, με μια λειψή αρχιτεκτονική ασφαλείας? Την Ευρώπη η οποία βλέπει τα νότια σύνορά της αναλώσιμα? Βλέπουμε την μετανάστευση, δρούμε σαν διαχειριστές μετανάστευσης, ενώ δεν βλέπουμε τις πηγές της μετανάστευσης, τα αίτια της μετανάστευσης. Τα αίτια από την Αφρική έως τη Μέση Ανατολή, από τη Μέση Ανατολή μέχρι την Ουκρανία. Ή βλέπουμε την Ευρώπη η οποία αντιμετωπίζει την κατάληψη εδαφών σαν μία λεπτομέρεια? Και ναι, κυρίες και κύριοι, αναφέρομαι για την Κύπρο, για την κατάληψη εδώ και 50 χρόνια του 38% της εδαφικής της κυριαρχίας από έναν αναθεωρητή, ο οποίος προσπαθεί να μπει αυτή τη στιγμή από το παράθυρο στην αρχιτεκτονική ασφαλεία της Ευρώπης. Και αυτό είναι κάτι απαράδεκτο. Επιτρέψτε μου να πω ότι η νοτιοανατολική Ευρώπη έχει αμεληθεί πάρα πολύ σε σχέση με τους εταίρους μας. Ελλάδα και Κύπρος είναι τα σύνορα της ασφάλειας, είναι τα σύνορα της ειρήνης και είναι και τα σύνορα της ανάπτυξης και προφανώς και της ενεργειακής αυτάρκειας στο μέλλον. Έχουμε έναν αναθεωρητή, ο οποίος αφενός από τη μία πλευρά κατέχει εδώ και 50 χρόνια το 38% ενός κράτους μέλους της Ευρώπης, της Κύπρου. Επίσης, ο ίδιος αναθεωρητής, και ναι, αναφέρομαι στην Τουρκία, απειλεί την Ελλάδα, κυρίαρχο κράτος μέλος της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης, κράτος μέλος του ΝΑΤΟ, με κάζους μπέλι, με πόλεμο, λόγω να μην επεκτείνει την κυριαρχία της, το κυρίαρχο δικαίωμα που έχει στα 12 ναυτικά μίλια, όπως ορίζει το Διεθνές Δίκαιο της Θάλασσας στο άρθρο 3, που δεν αφήνει να ασκήσει τα κυριαρχικά της δικαιώματα σε θαλάσσιες οικονομικές ζώνες, υφαλοκρηπίδα και ΑΟΖ, όπως ορίζουν το άρθρο 76 για υφαλοκρηπίδα του δικαίου της θάλασσας και τα άρθρα 55-57 για αποκλειστική οικονομική ζώνη. Και ξέρετε, αυτό δεν είναι μόνο θέμα Ελλάδας και Κύπρου. Είναι θέμα ευρωπαϊκών αξιών, είναι θέμα ευρωπαϊκής κυριαρχίας και είναι και θέμα ευρωπαϊκού κεκτημένου. Η Σύμβαση για το Δίκαιο της Θάλασσας υπεγράφει το 1982. Τέθηκε σε ισχύ το 1994. Αποτελεί κομμάτι, η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση σαν οργανισμός την έχει υπογράψει το 1998. Αποτελεί αναπόσπαστο κομμάτι του ευρωπαϊκού κεκτημένου. Κάτι το οποίο η Τουρκία οφείλει να σεβαστεί. Κάτι το οποίο επίσης οι αιμονικές Βρυξέλλες πρέπει να αντιληφθούν ότι η αρχιτεκτονική ασφαλείας της Ευρώπης δεν έχει μόνο μία απειλή. Δεν είναι μόνο η Ρωσία η απειλή μας. Έχουμε έναν αναθεωρητή, την Τουρκία. Έχουμε το Ισλαμικό κράτος, το οποίο φαίνεται να ανατέλει πάλι με σφαγές αμάχων, σφαγές χριστιανών στη Συρία, όπου ποιος κρύβεται από πίσω, μαντέψτε, δεν είναι δύσκολο, η Τουρκία. Έχουμε το μεταναστευτικό. Έχουμε ορδές μεταναστών στο Σουδάν. 10-12 εκατομμύρια έχουν αυτή τη στιγμή μετακινηθεί λόγω του αιματηρού εμφυλίου πολέμου. Έχουμε στην Αίγυπτο επίσης το 50% το οποίο είναι αδελφοί μουσουλμάνοι. Μην ξεχνάμε ότι με πραξικόπημα έπεσαν οι αδελφοί μουσουλμάνοι και ήρθε το καθεστώς Σίση στην εξουσία. Επίσης, έχουμε θέματα κυβερνοασφάλειας, ηλεκτρονικού πολέμου, έχουμε την κλιματική αποσταθεροποίηση. Δεν μπορούμε να βαφτίζουμε έναν αντίπαλο μόνο και να βαφτίζεται και να επικεντρώνεται η αρχιτεκτονική ασφαλείας εκεί. Και επιτρέψτε μου να πω ότι αυτό είναι ένα θέμα που πρέπει να το δούμε στο reform της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης, γιατί έχουμε ένα διευθυντήριο το οποίο πραγματικά είναι κοντόφθαλμο. Η κυρία Φόντερ Λάιεν έχει διορίσει 2 επιτρόπους, την κυρία Κάγια Κάλλας ως ύπατη εξωτερικής πολιτικής και τον κύριο Κουμπίλιους επίτροπο άμυνας. Είναι 2 άνθρωποι οι οποίοι προέρχονται από τις βαλτικές χώρες. Οι βαλτικές χώρες οι οποίες έχουν ένα μετατραυματικό στρες από το άσχημο σοβιετικό τους παρελθόν, αποτελούν το 0,95% της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης και θεωρώ, και συγγνώμη που θα μιλήσω λίγο πιο ομά, δεν είναι τσιφλίκι της Εστονίας όλη η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση. Πρέπει να γίνει μια αρχιτεκτονική ασφαλείας σφαιρική που να σέβεται ισόποσα όλα τα κράτη-μέλη. Είμαστε στην ώρα 0. Θυμηθείτε το αυτό, σας παρακαλώ.
Well, you know, thank you for that. There's a lot to unpack in what you said, of course. I think it also shows there's a number of different perspectives. To go back into the topic, however, you know, you mentioned Turkey a number of times. I think it is very clear that as it stands in the current form, there is zero chance that Turkey can join the European Union. The complexities is that it is a NATO country at the same time. But to go back perhaps, Janis, to a question that it's fundamentally the question about enlargement. The idea of just getting bigger for the sake of getting bigger should not drive this process. That is clear. I wonder, however, what is the case that you make to say a European Union at 32, at 33, 34 would be a better union? And if I can ask you just to make an informed guess on who do you think is going to make the first round? Because you have the Western Balkans, you have Ukraine, Moldova, but some argue the Nordics. That's not impossible either. You know, Iceland is bringing back this conversation.
Let me start where Winand put us, when he was comparing the current situation to what we were witnessing after 89-90. I think at that point in time, after some initial hesitation, it became rather quickly clear that the EU has to enlarge. And not for the sake of those who want to join the EU, but for its own enlightened self-interest. It took us then until 2004 for the Big Bang enlargement, and I would include 2007 with Romania and Bulgaria into this. So it took us a long time from 89-90 to get the EU to being enlarged. But we were convinced that it's the right thing to do. And we were convinced that it's the right thing to do because we were convinced that if we wouldn't, that the potential cost of us not enlarging the EU, not enlarging, would put a lot of costs on us.
What is the
European
cost?
Union.
Is it frustration? Is it Western Balkan countries specifically?
It's a historic cost that we would have to pay. If you go back to 89-90, if the EU would not have enlarged, where would we have been now? How much insecurity would we have in Eastern Europe? What would be the situation in the Western Balkans? I'm not saying that everything is perfect. I'm not saying that an enlargement, that the process that we witnessed after 89-90 was perfect, but it was something which was in our historic interest. It was a success story. By the way, it was also economically a success story. If you look into, I'll just give one example, if you look into Poland, which has been an engine of growth in Central and Eastern Europe, which has also affected Western Europe, I think we need to take all that into account. Unfortunately, today, I don't sense that member states feel the same sense of urgency. That there are still some who hope maybe we can avoid enlargement. Maybe we can limit it maybe to one or the other country. Maybe even we can limit it to one or the other country, not including Ukraine. Maybe we will get into a situation, it's not what I'm thinking, I'm just saying what I hear and what I sense, that we might be able to avoid enlargement, also Ukraine's accession, because Ukraine not being able to join the European Union because a potential negotiation result following negotiations between Trump and Putin, which will not allow Ukraine to to move into the European Union, or because the situation in the country might not be moving in the right direction. I think that historically, that's the wrong approach. The approach we need to have is that we actually make enlargement something we can trust and believe in. Because now if you talk to people in the countries who want to join the EU and people who want to join the European Union in these countries, they have lost trust. If you talk to people in the Western Balkans, they will tell us we've got the promise to join the European Union, but actually the EU is not delivering. Remember when Juncker became Commission President, even before he became Commission President, he was stating obviously the EU will not enlarge. It's not in the cards. That was giving the wrong signal to these countries. And then down the road, you ask yourselves, why did these countries not transform? Why did they not do the things they would have to do in order to come closer to the European Union? Why did certain powers in these countries came to power, affecting these countries negatively in terms of the transformation process? Well, if you cannot assume that the EU will deliver and will be ready to enlarge, why would you do the homework which is necessary in order to prepare to accede to the European Union? And let's not forget, and that's where the link is also to EU reform, when the Berlin Wall fell, we were already in the process of reforming the EU, which led to the Maastricht Treaty. Then afterwards we had Amsterdam, the Amsterdam Treaty, we had the Nice Treaty, we had the Constitutional Convention. We came to the Constitutional Treaty, which got a double no in France and in the Netherlands. That led to the Lisbon Treaty. So we had numerous reform rounds in order to prepare the EU for enlargement. And are we now in the process of actually even preparing this kind of a reform? I think this is another indicator of the fact that we're actually not believing that the EU will enlarge, should enlarge, and that we will prepare for it. By the way, which is playing into the hands of those who want to hollow the EU from within, who argue, let's enlarge in order to undermine the EU as a political project, to hollow out the EU as a European integration project. And that includes not only Viktor Orban, it includes all the others, including, for example, the AfD in my mother country, Germany, and many others who want the EU to move in a different direction. So I think we have a historic necessity to prepare for enlargement because it's in our interest. And the last question you were asking me, if you would ask me what my advice would be in terms of how enlargement should proceed, I would say we need something I would call the strategic regatta, meaning that we prepare for enlargement in different waves, that we try to agree on when we will have the next round of enlargement, which I think should be decided in the current political institutional cycle. So that's from now until 29, have a decision. If you look at it from today's perspective, Montenegro is probably the front runner. Yes. And given the situation in Ukraine would be potentially the second to join, but that's not the end of the story. You also would have to have a second wave and potentially a third wave. And again, you need to prepare for that internally. If, by the way, we're not able to do that and prepare for this, not scenario, I would call it a strategic option, I think then we need to think of how we can do that among those who are ready to move in that direction. When it comes to Hungary, you can put pressure on Hungary if it's a 26 versus 1 situation, as you described it. If Viktor Orban is opposing, there are ways of putting pressure on him in order for the enlargement process to proceed. Although it's an intergovernmental process, meaning that it always needs unanimity among the EU 27. So that makes it difficult. However, there are ways of putting pressure on one member state, in this case, the government of Viktor Orban, and let's see how the elections will go out in Hungary next time around. So there are ways to put pressure, but we might be called upon to assist, especially Ukraine, in a way which will require many more efforts from the perspective of EU member states. And if Hungary would not allow us to do so, we will have to find ways of doing that outside the EU treaties, outside the EU framework. I'm not saying that this is the best option. It's always the second best option. It's a dangerous option, but it might become necessary.
But it is what it is. Gentlemen, I'm going to ask you now for very short answers because I want to do a final round, but the clock is ticking in. We're very in time in Delphi. We have to end up in time. Given your focus on the Black Sea and the Balkans, Janis alluded to something that I think is very important. When you get asked to make progress for a goal, towards a goal, but it doesn't move, at some point you either begin to hate it or you get very frustrated. And politically, that is very dangerous. What sentiment do you pick up?
Well, first let me tell you that I especially asked to be posted in Eastern Europe when I was a Greek diplomat in order to get the real feeling of what happened after the 1990. And I can tell you that in all these Balkan countries, some of them eventually became full members, like Bulgaria, where I served twice, Romania, and so on. There was this feeling that they belong to the European house. And there was this great, how can I say, commitment to do as much as possible in order to facilitate and make faster this whole procedure, with all the great difficulties because of the Soviet-style economy, the economic oligarchy, the corruption, and so on. This is the same also for the Western Balkans. And if we don't act fast, as it was already mentioned, the people there are losing confidence. And it's not just making the European Union bigger by a number of states. It is incorporating into this unique European experiment a very vital part of Europe. We can't let these regions outside because there will always be the risk of creating problems, and we know what kind of problems. So it is for our own interest that we should, let me say, help them reach their goal faster than is the case until now. But unfortunately, with what has happened in the last years, I mean, as we said before, enlargement is not the priority. Now we try to see what Europe will be doing, having lost trust in the US and having lost trust in the, let me say, geostrategic umbrella that Europe, of the US, under which Europe was for all these 80 years now. This is more on the mind of everybody in Brussels, but also in Europe. Concerning Ukraine, I believe that, I'm sorry I'm going back to it, but we really lost a fantastic chance of keeping Ukraine neutral and a member of the EU. And I don't know what Ukraine will be acceding to the EU, what will happen in the next few years. Nobody can predict that.
It's complicated. Of course, the Ukrainians, what they argue is their goal was to do both EU and NATO. Of course, it's very complex. But I wonder, to you, Mr. Winand, now, if I can say, beyond Ukraine, and I think that's also part of the problem. The enlargement maybe is becoming a conversation just around Ukraine, and the Commission is insisting there are no favorites. It's going to be made based on models and reforms. Just as a final thought, how do you see this process evolving, and do you believe the Big Bang accession, many countries at the same time altogether, that it's over for good? We're going to see gradual and countries differently.
Well, what you saw in the 90s is that the Commission was always very much in favor of an individual country merit-based process. But then the pressure from the member states became bigger and bigger, and from the Council to go for a group enlargement. I think, as I said, there are 4 categories of candidate members who are very different. So I see quite a challenge in going for a group accession. Also because within the groups, within the 4 groups, take the Western Balkans, the situation in the countries is very different. And there are countries where the government is really working on enlargement. There are countries where the government is not at all cooperating, or where they are cooperating as a facade, but behind it, in fact, they are not moving forward. That is a kind of process where the EU pretends going for enlargement and the countries pretend to go for accession, and then both are not really working on the process. But here again, I think we need this political will. We talked about Orban. I think now for the first time, Friedrich Merz has said that this should be finished. Yes. And I think it's for the first time that a big member state clearly says, well, it's enough. And it is really time that's enough. And the moment that the political will is there, I think things can start moving. The same is true for the Western Balkans. We had a totally messy process after the famous Juncker quote that Janis also mentioned at the beginning of his mandate, where he said there will be no accession in my mandate. That was catastrophic for the process. At that moment, the process started derailing. And the Commission realized it in 20 when it came with a new strategy, which was reinforced after Ukraine, because then the geopolitical necessity became even more clear. But we now have a process which is, say, as an academic exercise, it's really good. It's well thought over. But now the question is, what is the practical situation on the ground? And we see in a number of countries governments that are afraid for their own future if their country becomes a member of the EU.
Like which country?
Well, I don't know names, but I don't say names, but I think everyone knows.
Does it start with S?
It could be. No, so, and I think that is something that has to be addressed. And therefore, the outreach to the civil society is extremely important, and also to go again for the values of the EU, because what the population is wanting is being part of this European community, and the community is based on values.
Just very briefly, Ukraine, Moldova, they seem to go together. Do you think 2030 is doable? Is that something that you say is realistic?
Well, I learned in the 90s that you shouldn't talk about dates. We should go for the content of the process, because at any rate, the reforms have to take place whether you become a member or not. And the moment that a country really starts moving is when the government says, we don't do it for enlargement, for accession, we do it because it's needed for our country.
It's good for us. Final thought, of course, we're running out of time, but I want to give you still the opportunity. I know you said the perception of risk maybe changes depending on which country you are, but specifically perhaps if we go into the maritime situation, the Black Sea, the risks that you may see there, just as a final thought, you know, where are the areas in this context of bigger enlargement that you would say the focus should be?
Κοιτάξτε να δείτε, η Ευρώπη δυστυχώς έχει επιδείξει, όπως σας είπα, πολύ χαμηλά αντανακλαστικά στη διαχείριση κρίσεων. Για να μπορέσει να γίνει ανταγωνιστική στο μέλλον, για να ανταγωνιστεί τις δύο πυρδυνάμεις, την Κίνα και τις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες, θα πρέπει να επενδύσει στην τεχνητή νοημοσύνη, στο AI, και για να το κάνει αυτό πρέπει να έχει πρόσβαση στις σπάνιες γέες και στα critical minerals. Χρειάζεται μια ολοκληρωμένη στρατηγική ασφαλείας. Για μένα είναι μεγάλο λάθος που δεν αξιοποιήθηκε τόσο καιρό η Γρυλανδία. Είναι μεγάλο λάθος που η Ουκρανία γίνεται ένα πόκερ διαμοιρασμού μεταξύ Ηνωμένων Πολιτειών και Ρωσίας. Θα πρέπει να είναι λίγο πιο ενεργή η πολιτική της. Θα πρέπει να ξυπνήσουμε, και το λέω πραγματικά με όσο καλοπροαίρετα γίνεται. Δεν υπάρχει άλλο περιθώριο, και επιτρέψτε μου να κλείσω με δύο έτσι ρητά, ένα του Ηράκλειτου, τα πάντα ρί, και του Σένεκα, του φιλόσοφου του Ρωμαίου, ότι Veritas audit moras. Η αλήθεια απεχθάνεται την καθυστέρηση. Πρέπει να δράσουμε άμεσα. Και σε όλες τις γωνίες της Ευρώπης, κανείς δεν πρέπει να εξαιρεθεί, για να προσπαθήσουμε να κάνουμε μια ειλικρινή ευρωπαϊκή ολοκλήρωση υπέρ των ευρωπαϊκών λαών και όχι της γραφειοκρατίας κάποιων ανθρώπων ακατάλληλων, οι οποίοι δυστυχώς μας οδηγούν στο χείλος του γκρεμού. Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ.
Well, thank you. Obviously, we have now reached the end of the session. I think you all had different perspectives, at times very different perspectives, but the one thing you agreed is that whatever gets done or is done has to be quick, and it's urgent. That has been the common thread in this panel. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure. Obviously, great to be in Delphi again for another year, 10th year anniversary. And just a reminder, another session will continue, so please stay here, and a round of applause for our wonderful speakers today. Thank you very much.